Hallo.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome to the inaugural meeting of the DNS Delegation Working Group. I'm Brian Haberman, and this is my co-chair, Dwayne Wessels. We're your hosts for this festivities. And abling assisting us is our work group secretary, Tommy, who's hiding over here in the red shirt. So anything that gets screwed up is my fault and Dwayne's fault. And anybody who needs something fixed, go talk to Tommy. A couple of things moving forward. So the all-important note well, everybody should recognize that this is material that they need to understand in order to participate in the IETF. The big things here are to understand what all of those BCPs at the bottom mean. So if you have not read them, please do so. One of the key things that makes the IETF successful is actually having constructive participation and engagements amongst all the participants. So this is really my point of making sure everybody is acting as professionally as possible to make sure that we're as productive as possible. There are pathways to get things rectified if you think that that's not happening. I do know that at least one of our ombuds team people is here. Hi, Pete. So feel free to reach out to them if you think that anybody is acting unprofessionally in this environment. A couple of things from from an operational point of view. Everybody should be signed in to Meet Echo as a part of the participation in the meeting. This allows you to join the mic queue, participate in any kind of show of hands that we carry out in order to make sure we have a good understanding of what's going on. For remote participants, you should have your audio and video off unless you're going to be presenting. So I know we should have at least one remote presenter today. So when Roy slot comes up, he'll pop up here. All right, next. So this is our agenda, and this is your opportunity to tell us whether or not you would like to see any changes to it. We did not see a whole lot of discussion on changes to it when we called on the mailing list, but this is your opportunity if you see something you want to change here to bring it up now. All right, so we're going to go get started. One of the things I wanted to do is make sure everybody was on the same page as far as it goes with the charter. And what I really want to do here is just capture, two important parts. One is that by our charter, we're required to actually generate the requirements document before we can start any kind of protocol work. What we see here needs to be a broad general consensus that people agree with what's in those requirements, and that we've actually adopted it and taken it on as a working group item. The other part of this is, what we're actually trying to accomplish here, and that is what we do in order to make sure that authoritative servers can signal capabilities to recursive resolvers. All right, so we'll spend most of the meeting today talking about requirements and inputs to those requirements. And hopefully what will come out of the working group today is understanding where we need to go in order to move that document. If the one that we have currently as an individual document is worth a worthwhile basis for a working group document, or if there are other things that people want to discuss from that perspective. So any question on the charter sides of things? All right, cool. So then the first agenda topic is the actual individual requirements document. Taylor, are you presenting? All right.
Okay, that's not reassuring. I've just been told that the clicker might not work, so we'll see how that goes. So hi, everybody. It is fantastic to see you here for the start of IETF week. So I am representing the team of the initial draft authors of me, Ed Lewis, Jim Reed, and Tim Wazinski, which is what made up that wire Lila in the draft name. And you're right, it doesn't work. Okay. So the basics are that we did submit our draft early in this month, just ahead of the deadline, and it is now available on the data tracker. We took the approach that we wanted to make it basically the hard requirements. These are the things that are absolutely required for a new protocol to be successful. And then the soft requirements are, well, what are the problems we're actually trying to solve? What features would the protocol have that makes it useful to even be engaging in this? And so we posted it and asked for some feedback and did get feedback on the DELEG working group list. If you are not a member of the DELEG working group list, it is dd@ietf.org. You can join all the usual ways you join an IETF list. And so now we are here seeking adoption for the requirements draft that the group is required to have. So our initial set of hard requirements listed these from the draft. That and one thing that the draft clarifies also is, although there was a previous draft for a new RR type in the DNS that was named DELEG, in the context of this draft, DELEG just means whatever the new protocol is, whether it uses the DELEG RR type, whether it uses a name in a different part of the hierarchy, whatever mechanism comes up with. In this context, DELEG means the new thing. So whatever the new thing is, it can't disrupt any of the existing registration model of domains, because that would be a death knell for getting it anywhere. DELEG must not change the current namespace semantics. This got most of the discussion on the list after it was posted, so I will be talking about this in a future slide. It can't negatively impact most DNS software. We don't want to deploy something that makes existing software fall over. we didn't set a hard limit on what it means to say most. Admittedly, that is a little ambiguous, with the goal being that, with the practical recognition being, we can't test 100% of the software that's out there, but we can test major resolvers, major servers, and observe whether there is any wide-scale problem that would exist for the deployment of a new method. And DELEG should still, of course, work with DNSSEC. We've designed this thing for authenticating names that are served by the DNS and other records. And so we have to be able to secure that using the existing security mechanisms. And then finally, it is a new protocol also should not be measurably harder to use than the existing method of setting up NS records. There is one additional hard requirement, by the way, that is not in the draft. I saw a little bit of feedback that's suggested maybe it shouldn't be, but I, as an author who have not yet discussed it with my other authors, agree with Eric Nygren that one of these specific goals should be explicitly that it supports a multiple operator environment. That was something that it should have gone in. It's one of those, like many of the other hard requirements, should be obvious kind of things, but we should absolutely make it explicit that we're need to continue to support, as a DNS always has, multiple operators for its own. So our soft requirements are that we are trying to solve the problem of being able to use all these wonderful new DNS transport mechanisms that we've had come out of the IETF, whether it's DNS over TLS or over QUIC or over HTTPS. We want to have a better way of having resolvers identify when they can be talking one of these protocols. So DELEG should make clear all the details for connecting what the document calls a service access point. The service access point is the tuple of, the address of the name server you're trying to contact, the port you want to contact it on, what protocol you need, any other parameters you need, for example, a cert in order to be able to set up your connection with the service access point. We are also trying to minimize transaction costs and usage. Transaction cost comes in a number of different ways, whether it's server overhead, packet overhead, and so on. We would like this to not be a wonderful new way to create denial of service attacks on the internet. DELEG should also enable an operator to manage DNS service more completely. This is one of the use cases that we discussed more later, but the requirement here was based around the idea that right now we've tried to address in multiple ways how an operator can manage the cryptographic DNSSEC data on behalf of their customers who might not know anything at all about how DNS works. And so one of the problems we'd like to be able to solve is simplifying that on behalf of operators. And DELEG should allow for mapping to conventional NS-based delegation. The idea here is that, the trope of the single source of truth. Like, if you're going to set up DNS delegation information for your name and you want to use the new mechanism, presumably then you can generate the NS records to use the old mechanism just based on your new configuration for how your delegation looks. And we'd like DELEG to be extensible. We have these initial use cases that we're trying to solve, but we'd also like to make it so that we can use DELEG in a way to solve additional problems as yet unspecified, although some other ideas have been brainstormed, without having to go through the pain of trying to update as much of the ecosystem as this current effort is going to take. And then finally, one of the things that got mentioned, and we expect it would be a little controversial, is but it has been mentioned as a wish list item, that it would be great if, since we're talking about the communication between how a child relates to their parent, that there should be some way for the child to let the parent know that that this can be available. And I think I should have put a more tag on that because I have another slide about that. So the two that we're going to dig into a little bit more are that one and the previous one that I mentioned about what it means about existing namespace semantics. Should be the next slide, I think. Or maybe, our writing style. So in writing the draft, we tried to make it deliberately pithy. We wanted to just focus in on the core design values, didn't spend a lot of words explaining why each of those requirements was there and so on, or what the different models could all be. And so it was supposed to be easily digestible, something that was just a few pages to be able to take down and get the core ideas of what the working group is attempting to do. And we also didn't want to presuppose a specific solution. For example, I am a member of one of the co-authors on a proposal that I still think should be the way to go. There are other proposals, and we are here to discuss them all. Requirements is not trying to drive the discussion into one particular solution. But one of the things that is open to you to either mention at the mic or bring up on the list lately, if you think that we need more verbiage around like why each point is there, that perhaps it does need additional rationale for it, then we can certainly add that to the document. But the initial goal was keep it short, simple, straight to the point. So this is the biggest thread I think that came up on the mailing list. Was I had this statement in the draft that said DELEG must not change the current namespace semantics. That first sentence, several people understandably read it as saying, well, wait a minute, if we're changing the way delegation is done, of course we're changing current namespace semantics. And if we're not doing that, then there's no reason to even be doing this group. So I admit that my wording was unfortunately a little ambiguous there. The way I meant it to read was that existing DNS zones, whatever, the existing NS delegations, all the existing aspects of a zone would continue to work the way that they currently work. So that was the current namespace semantics that wasn't supposed to be changed. It was like the old stuff should, be completely oblivious to whatever our new method is, and it would keep working exactly the same way. So I have a proposed statement down here that you can read and provide feedback on. More wordsmithing is welcome, but hopefully this does address this issue with ambiguity in the wording and what was intended by don't mess with the existing semantics. And then that last item about a soft requirement about DELEG supporting an in-band means for the child to let its parent know that it has updated delegation information. As I said, it had been mentioned in brainstorming. It is kind of aligned with this general idea that we're talking about of how the parent-child relationship exists with regard to delegations. So it could well be addressed by a document that's currently working its way through DNSOP, this generalized DNS notifications. Most of you know that the notify op is already used to signal that, oh, you should start a zone transfer. Notify could be used to signal other types of record updates. I personally like that idea. As a soft requirement in this document, it's possible for a new protocol to just say, oh, and yes, to get this feature, you will just go ahead and use this thing that got standardized in DNSOP. So because soft requirements are kind of address just the problems that we'd like to see solved, and it's not required that every soft requirement actually be solved, maybe it should come out of this draft. If you have a strong feeling either way about whether to leave it in and say, oh, yes, we'd still like to see something like this, even if it's done by DNSOP work, well, then great. But so that's essentially the question on that. Keep it or just dump the item from the draft. And then, okay, Tim is Moonshiner, Tim Wazinski, who has set up his GitHub for where the draft is. So if you want to open any new issues or send some pull requests for text, they will be welcome there currently. However, I anticipate that once the working group, I don't think you already have a repository set up, but you will probably, oh, we do? Okay, we already have a Git repository. So if the draft gets adopted, then the document editing will, of course, move to that. So per the charter, this draft is expected to be published as an informational RFC. And so we are asking you, please, to adopt the draft.
Does anybody have any clarifying questions for this document?
Roy's online.
Hi, this is Roy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. What I'm missing from the requirements, maybe it's not a requirement, is the part that allows DS aliasing. Thanks.
I didn't quite hear. Yes. Okay, well, is it or that was the part of, I guess maybe it is. I thought there was one that essentially covered that. Paul Hoffman is also shaking his head. So that is a puzzle. That is a well, it was what was trying to be addressed was the idea of operators being able to manage more completely, and that's part of where the DS aliasing comes in, right? Do you concur with that, Mr. Ahrens? The goal, you know, with the requirement of trying to make things easier for operators, that's where DS aliasing was supposed to factor in.
Gotcha. I'll read it again. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Okay. Yeah. Ah. Can't hear you.
Tap, 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 and it's hot. Okay, very good. Rick Wilhelm, PIR. Thanks for the draft. In reading it, I think that one of the things that was good is that the distinction between hard and soft requirements. I thought that was good. Two questions. One, and this is going to sound flip and glib. I apologize in advance. Was there anything you left out? I say that with a smile on my face. Second question. I'm wondering, and it might be an interesting thing to augment the draft with, the rationale about why some is hard, must, and why some are soft. I'm not taking issue with any of the divisions, right? But just that might be a good thing to capture in the draft, because some people are going to quibble with them wherever you put them. Because really, there's hard, soft, and then there's out, and it's not clear to me if there was anything that was left out, left on the cutting room floor. But so anyway, good draft regardless. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm crushed by your glibness. So the only thing that I am aware of that was left out was not intentionally left out and will be added in was this idea that multiple operator environments really, need to continue to be supported. If somebody is aware of something that got left out, you feel like your pet idea, that was glib, and I don't mean it that way. If you felt like your idea about something that should be required was not included, we are absolutely open to considering including it. We did not deliberately exclude anything.
Wes. Thanks for putting together, this group has come about amazingly quick, and you already have a retirements document ready to be adopted on like presentation 1 of the working group. Well done. I'm impressed with the already sort of scope creep. So Wes Hardiger, USC ISI, and the ICANN board, not speaking for the ICANN board as always. I wonder, so the two things sort of that caught my attention are, one, the need to do back propagation to the parent, which I think is an important problem. I sort of question if that is sort of within scope of the working group. I could argue it probably both ways, but I think that's something the working group really needs to consider is, to some extent, that problem is bigger than DELEG, right? So hence DNSOP might be the more appropriate place to do something like that. The other thing I note is that putting in the backwards compatibility issue is a fascinating one, because to a large extent that's an operational considerations sort of specification. And we're going to produce something new. By the way, everybody must continue to support NS records. I'm curious at how the working group's going to land with respect to saying this is always backwards compatible without disallowing people to only publish DELEG future zones, right? So that's going to be hard to wordsmith.
I can give you, not speaking on behalf of all the authors, that I personally look forward to a future where you have DELEG only zones, and you might not really care about whether something's reachable by NS. And I think that's an acceptable state to be in the same way we accept websites now that are not reachable under unsecured HTTP, for example. So I think that's the goal should be that NS will continue to work indefinitely, but to the extent that it migrates into the future where NS becomes less and less important, I'm perfectly okay with that solution.
Paul Hoffman, a couple of things. To answer Roy, the aliasing, it should not be in this draft because we have an aliasing draft, and that's in the charter and such like that. This draft is about the protocol that other things can use, and that includes, as we know, both aliasing and transport. Second issue is talking about child talking to parent. I don't think that's a requirement at all, because there are many people who feel that the child should not talk to the parent, only the operator can. There shouldn't be anything that prevents the protocol from having a child talk to it, but I can't imagine that the working group would create a protocol that says, and you cannot listen to this group or whatever. So that to me is not an issue. And also to Wes's last point, I didn't see anything in the requirements document that said NS records will always be required. I read the current document, and I agree with it as to say the current semantics are necessary for now. So that the day that the DELEG RFC comes out, we cannot say, and NS records all die.
Right.
But anything beyond that could be future working group, or as you say, just operator choice.
Jim Reed with a glib answer to the glib question that Rick posed earlier. I think really the intention, certainly from my point of view as one of the co-authors of this document, is to try and get a sense from the working group that the requirements things that we've thrown together so far are just about right, you know, in terms of where the mix is between optionals, hard and soft requirements, and also to ask everybody else here, is there anything we've missed?
I cut off.
Oh, you're on? You're number.
Go ahead, Joe.
You're now number one, sir.
As usual, finally.
Yeah.
There's some text in there that I think probably covers this, but I think that it's maybe worth being more explicit. I think this mechanism needs to be deployable. And backwards compatibility is part of that. And compatibility with ancient assumptions about the namespace as part of that. But I think it makes sense to actually say explicitly this needs to be incrementally deployable. It needs to be useful in a meaningful way without having flag day 100% deployment. And so I think that would be a good addition.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure I will welcome text, but I'll come up with a draft statement. But I think actually the last thing you said there about you shouldn't require a flag day is probably gets straight to the heart of the matter. So we good?
We're good. Thanks, Dale.
Thank you.
All right. So next up is Paul to talk about two different ideas.
Oh, you put transports first. I thought we were going to do aliasing first.
I'll change it.
I think people care much more about aliasing, as we saw from the mic line. Okay. So tail just covered, next slide. Tail just covered the requirements for the protocol. Now we have in the charter two protocol items that we are going to do, and there seems to be plenty of interest. We aren't going to start these until the protocol is done, but they do have some requirements. So what this presentation is the requirements just on what's going to be the aliasing protocol, and not both of the others, because there are possibly going to be ones after those two. And this presentation is fairly short, and I want to emphasize, these are just first guesses that I sort of gleaned from the mailing list. This is not the beginning of a draft. We don't need this draft for a while, and we might not even have a requirements draft for aliasing. That might just be in the aliasing protocol spec. But what we do know is there's going to be a protocol for DELEG, and then additions to the protocol for aliasing and transport and maybe other things. So I just want to make that super clear why I'm here and not Tail continuing to talk about requirements. Got it? Great. Next. So for aliasing, there's two sides, of course, the parent side and then the receiver side. One thing that I think, and I didn't say hard and soft, I did must and might, whatever, y'all can figure it out. On the parent side, the protocol must be able to specify multiple target servers for aliasing. So that we aren't going to have aliasing only allow you to alias to one. You want to be able to say that there are multiple. And it must be able to say what the transports to those will be. That is, it's not just going to be DNS over port 53. You can say, I am aliasing over here and here are some transports. depending on how people in the room feel, and this is why I have put this as a might. I know some people are going to feel that this third bullet should be a must, and other people are going to be saying, no, we don't have to, is that in order, since this is going to, as we said from the requirements, this is going to be a DNSSEC signed response that the resolver is going to get. Maybe you are sending also the keying material with, so that you can do authentication in one round and you're not having to trust the web of trust or whatever, however that goes. Some people think that this is absolutely needed for creating a correct chain of trust. Other people disagree. So that's why I have it as a might. That's going to be, and when it comes down to coming to specifying these requirements, I believe this is going to be a hard issue for us to come to consensus on. And I think it's super important because we all do care about the security of this at this point, and we get another chance to work at it. So, and then there's also the question of preventing round trips, is that when you're saying please alias to these servers, you might also give the address records. Why make them go out and do a glue fetch and things like that? Might not. Next slide. Now, on the aliased side, the place where you're going, the pointed to server must be able to specify whatever a current name server is going to say for that zone. So it can't be that once you've been aliased, that aliased to server has some limitations that current servers don't. People, like you don't want to have to choose, oh, I can't use aliasing because then if I go over there, that guy isn't as strong as just using NS records. And the second one is that the aliasing might be able to re-alias somewhere else, to some level. Some people want that, some people don't. That, that will be another requirement. And the last one is that it might be able to, once you've been aliased over here, that alias to server might say, by the way, I am authoritative for this other zillion thing, so you don't have to go through another one. You can come straight to me. That one's going to be pretty iffy because now you're trusting it for something that you weren't sent to it for. That's outside of the DNS, the normal DNS model, but some people asked for that when we were talking about aliasing. Next slide. I think that is the last one on this one. So I can take questions on this, or we can just skip over questions because, again, this was very loose. This is not something that's in a document. We can wait on this, up to you all. I don't think we need to be having a heavy discussion on this because it's further down the road. But just to be clear that there are separate requirements on aliasing. So I see Ben in the queue if you want to.
Ben Schwartz, Meta. The one thing I want to point out is I'd like to see a requirement related to in bailiwick delegations, or whatever we're calling it now.
We're not calling it anything, but I hear what you're saying. Right. Okay.
Because I think that subsumes these questions about whether IP addresses can be conveyed, whether certificates can be conveyed.
Mm-hmm.
The place where that comes to a head is when you're in bailiwick, so you have a dependency cycle. You can't resolve anything below the zone cut without some help.
Okay. Sounds good. So when requirements come up for this, we can do that. Okay. Warren
Kamari, Google. I suspect I'm just misunderstanding the last bullet, but that feels very much like the old cache poisoning attack where you'd ask for NewYorkTimes.com.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I felt that way, so I certainly didn't put it as a must, but somebody asked for it because it could greatly expedite future queries. So that's a later discussion. Yep. Matt?
Matt Poundset from DNSOARC. Something that's a common operational problem that maybe it's covered by these, but it doesn't seem explicit to me, is the ability for a pointed to server to indicate not here. You've been delegated to a server, like you've been sent somewhere that can't answer your question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. That would be good. And I guess now we're into the others, but since they're going so quick, maybe we can do it. Yeah. Lehman?
Hi, Lars Lehman from NetNode. I do agree with you that we might not need a requirements document for this right now, but if you could please just put the text into I wouldn't say document because everyone thinks it's a draft, but a compiled file that we can store in the same Git system as the rest of the stuff.
That's a thought.
So that we have access to it once we get to the point where we do need this document and we can remember what the job you already done.
Might do pull requests against it. Does that sound reasonable for you folks? Okay, I will undo this into a text file and throw it that way, and then just let you folks as chairs do the access to it stuff.
Perfect.
Cool. Yep.
Thank
Great.
you.
And I'll do that for the next one as well. So yeah.
Hello.
Hello, Joe.
So I'm a bit new to this, so maybe it's a clarifying question. You're talking about servers here, as in the server you're pointing to. And I thought this general topic was talking about names. So we're pointing at names, not servers. Am I right, or am I
Yes, but that name is going to be serviced by a server. So maybe what we need is that there's a requirement for terminology ahead of time. Okay. So, and in fact, you might be the best person to do this because what you just said of you're coming late to it. No, seriously, all of us who are laughing right now have gotten too far into this, and we believe we know what we want. So if you think you have some terminology in your head, absolutely throw it there, and then that would be a good start. Because you notice I made up the pointed to. No one ever said that. I just made that up as I was making these slides. That might be a crappy term.
No, fair enough. This will teach me.
Yeah,
so that's good.
Yeah. But I think that's a reasonable requirement is agreed on terminology. Okay.
Andre,
Yeah, Andre. Sorry.
Just be very, very careful with aliasing because all the CNAME, NS, fan outs, it still haunts me in the night. So,
okay.
So please be very careful from the very beginning.
So that's a must requirement to be careful. That's right. Yes, must not haunt Andre. Don't know if we can really do that, but yeah. Okay. So now switching to the last thing that we have in our charter, which is multiple transports, a way of using delegation to say multiple transports. So next slide. And so this looks like the first slide of the last presentation because it is. And again, the requirements for this will be different than the requirements for aliasing. And both of these are different than the requirements for the overall protocol. And again, I pulled these off of what I saw in the mailing list and in hallway conversations. They might be totally wrong. Go for it. So the first is the protocol must be able to specify multiple types of transports. And this list is explicitly one short. You'll notice that there's no DOH in this. That's because this was all heavily discussed in DPRIVE when we were thinking, what are the transports that DPRIVE, and no one came up with a good reason for DOH if DOT was allowed. Someone might come up with one and whatever, but for here, I started with the list that DPRIVE had come to after a fairly heavy discussion, which was DO53, DOT, DOQ. So the protocol that is specifying transport must also be able to specify the expected transports for the NS records. So, you know, you've got some NS records. Now here are the transports for them. Same question as the third bullet on the last one. Might be able to give you keying information so that you don't have to do more round trips or believe in the web of trust. That's a might. That will be heavily argued. There are going to be people for both of these who are very passionate about different trust models. I think that there is a meta requirement here, not Meta the company, Ben, Meta the real Meta, of is there a requirement that we handle multiple trust models? One trust model being DNSSEC, one trust model being PKIC certificate kind of things. I don't know the answer to that. I have worked on this stuff since I was, running the PKIX mailing list a zillion years ago, and I go back and forth. I don't know if there is a requirement that we say there's going to be one or there's going to be multiple, but I assure you, people in the room have hard opinions already. And then the last one is that the protocol might be able to specify address records again. So going back to the question of in bailiwick, not in bailiwick, and such like that. Can we can the DELEG protocol hand you those addresses already so you don't have to do more lookups? Next, or that might be, yeah, that's right. So this is it for it. So I think this will be easier than aliasing, but I also think that it's going to tickle the same problems that aliasing tickled. Joe.
Sorry?
Oh, well, yeah. I can tell the difference between Joe and Ray.
Oh. I just wanted, you mentioned that I understand where you've taken that list of transports from.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that if somebody has a really good reason to include, change the way you've chosen those, then
yeah.
I don't know why we need a good reason to include things. If we've got defined transports, don't we need a good reason to leave them out?
Well, the good reason for leaving DOE out was that it's actually much more overhead than DOT.
I mean, it's defined, people use it.
Yep,
So,
yep, could be.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Could be. Yep. EKG.
Hi, thanks for writing this stuff down. Someone in the chat said, I still don't know what this group means by aliasing. And I have the sneaking suspicion that I'm also ignorant about that.
Great.
And I am wondering why we think we're going to do aliasing, which seems more ambiguous to me, before we do transport, which seems less ambiguous.
That's the way the charter came out. But perfectly good question. Maybe we start them at the same time and one finishes earlier. Again, I believe that there are many fundamental questions that apply equally to both of them. So, yeah. Ray.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, Ray Bellis, ISC. On the specification of public keys, do we maybe need to be a little bit more explicit that you're going to need multiple public keys because you need one for each name potentially? It's not going to be one key per zone.
Could be.
It's essentially, if you've got 3 NS names, they potentially all need a separate key.
Right.
And regardless of the transports.
Yep. Yep.
Ben Schwartz, sometime Doughboy.
Yep.
I am sad to see Doe not on the list, and I'm fine with it. And it does have some distinct technical requirements, overhead aside. Because we never agreed on a standardized path, you need to convey additional metadata if you want to bootstrap a Doe connection. I think we may get there, but it doesn't have to be in the requirements.
Okay.
On aliasing, I think that we are also just kind of going to get there. After all, we do have a proposal floating around that that fully addresses it. So it will become concrete, and then it will become comprehensible.
Right. But I do like the requirement of that we actually do terminology and maybe do that really early. Warren.
So Warren Kamari, Google, and I suspect that this is a detail or rat hole, but I always enjoy rat holes.
We've noticed this about you.
Isn't it harder to detect that traffic is DNS traffic if it's done over DOE than if it's done over DOT? And I think that that's a useful feature.
That was what we said.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm co-author on it, and I'm still not convinced. So.
Ben Schwartz. Warren, I believe you are correct, and that is one good reason why I think we will get there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And Jim. Then you.
Yeah. Jim, just for a quick response to Warren's question, I seem to remember there was a discussion in the NRW about some traffic analysis thing that could detect DNS queries that were going over DOH just because of the way the traffic was shaped. I might be wrong.
But also,
my memory may be fake. It might be erratic on that, but we may want to look up for that. I think it was a meeting in Montreal, actually.
Yeah, but again, part of it was just that certain addresses only respond for DNS stuff, and therefore you can tell it's DNS traffic because that address, regardless, is only going to respond to DNS traffic. So
yeah, if I remember for that one, Paul, it wasn't about the actual endpoints of the addresses. It was actually the packet sizes
yeah,
and the intervals between them.
yeah. So okay, very good. So again, I will turn this into text. That will just appear as something in the GitHub, in the working group's GitHub repo, and I will not be controlling it, and we don't need to worry about this until we're done with protocol. Scored. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm James Galvin. I'm co-chair of the regex extensions, registration extensions protocols working group. This presentation is really intended to be informative. I don't have any particular ask of the requirements document, but nonetheless, there are some important details here, and you know, others may think that you want to put something in the requirements document or not. That's entirely up to you. I'm not opposed to it. For identification purposes, yes, my day job employer is actually a registry service provider. We're actually the #2 service provider in the world. So I come here in 2 dimensions. I have to deal with this kind of stuff on a daily basis. And yes, as it turns out, I am a member of the ICANN board, but as Wes is so fond of saying, I'm definitely not speaking for the ICANN board. So next slide, please. This really is about understanding that there is cooperation between communities and ICANN and IETF that does have to happen sometimes. I deal with this in spades in the registration extensions working group. There's a handful of us in the IETF community who are also active in the ICANN community, and stuff just happens because it needs to happen in that way. Regex is really the home for all things EPP and RDAP. And of course, you have a couple of documents out there, even for this group, which make some suggestions for EPP and RDAP extensions, which is fine. You know, there's a question here as to why we should care about GTLDs. I really am focused on GTLDs here. I know that the agenda talked about TLD perspectives, but these issues impact GTLDs, and they are significant. The work that's going on here, which I'm generally supportive of, has the potential to significantly impact my operations. So that's a pretty big deal to me, what's going on here. And that's really what I'm trying to call out here. It's important to recognize that GTLDs, distinct from CCTLDs, are really, you know, half of this industry. Okay, we share that. So I do think that kind of makes it important for us to be aware of and think about how these things work. And GTLD operations are subject to what are called consensus policies on the ICANN side. Now, folks here really don't need to know what that means and how those things come about, but those are mutually agreed requirements. So we don't get to just make changes to our registry. We don't get to just make changes to what's in a TLD zone. And that's the message that you need to receive more than anything else. You can think of consensus policies as internet standards in the sense that, you know, this is a significant process by which you get there. But consensus policies actually have enforcement, whereas internet standards don't. And you don't really have to understand all of that. That's for people in ICANN to understand. But it's just useful to be aware that these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with as we move forward with this. Next slide, please. So what is the particular issue that I want you to be aware of here? There's this hard requirement. It's actually the first of the hard requirements about not disrupting existing registration models. Now, depending on how one wants to define model and what you want that to be, you know, I already said that the work here that's going to proceed has the potential to significantly impact my operations. Okay, so I'm not here to debate whether that's a disruption of the registration model or not. I'm actually comfortable with this statement as it's written here. You know, I'm trusting the whole process here to work things out. And like I said, there's a few of us here who work in both places and are familiar with this, and we'll be part of this working group. So we'll be watching and paying attention to interesting things. But it is useful to know that there's a disruption going on here and that we're going to see it. The two things that you need to know is that provisioning of GTLD zones is actually controlled. It's controlled in EPP. As you well know, there's even a draft out there which already talks about an extension in EPP. Should this group go down the path of there needing to be a new resource record type, well, that needs to be provisioned in some way, and that'll be provisioned with EPP. So, that's an impact, and that impacts registrars as well as registries. If you want that to work in the GTLD industry, there's a change we all have to make. And that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of implementations and software. I have to say, I didn't put it on the slide here, but I thought it was interesting that there was supposed to be minimal implementations to certain DNS operations, minimal changes to DNS operations. But I noticed that registration systems weren't included in that list, although I don't know how you could do that anyway. The second thing to know about resource record types is if we end up going down the path of a new resource record type, you need to know that those things are restricted. We can't just put new resource record types in a TLD zone on the GTLD side, okay? That's absolutely forbidden. I mean, there's an explicit list of what's allowed in a GTLD zone file and what can go there. Now, these things are not hard problems, okay? Well, let me rephrase that. These are solvable problems, okay? And there are those of us who work on both sides. We'll make sure that the ICANN community, does its part to make sure that these kinds of things are possible. But this is more of just being aware that operationally, as we figure out what we want here, there's some complementary work that's going to happen in the ICANN world. You don't actually have to do anything. This is not me, ICANN, asking you for anything. And I don't think the IETF needs to ask ICANN for anything. But as communities, those of us doing all of this work, we need to do our part on both sides. And really just here to make sure that everyone is fully aware of this as we think about what we're doing going forward. That's it for me.
Got a question from Jim.
Yeah, Jim Reid, thanks, Jim, for that very clear explanation of what the potential problems or issues are going to be in ICANN. However, I think there might be some other concerns, and I'm glad you're going to have to deal with them so that we don't have to, because I suspect as we get further down the path with getting something done with DELEG, we might run into situations which will actually mean that DELEG and whatever our successors might come on through that will complicate some of the problems that people have inside with ICANN, with takedowns and other kind of privacy concerns around domain name registrations. And it might be an idea just to start thinking about this right now, even though we still don't have any clear ideas about what DELEG is going to look like when it finally comes out the door of the IETF.
So I agree. I'm, like I said, I'm generally supportive of DELEG. As far as I know, the handful of us who work in both places are supportive, and a lot of applications here, a lot of possibilities, and look forward to it.
John?
I'm John Levine, and I'm on a few of the same committees you are. I guess it would be useful if you would sort of comment on what I see as sort of a step function at ICANN. It's like you can change nothing, or as soon as you change anything, there's this process. So like we wanted to put some .bank and .insurance wanted to put some DMARC records in their TLD zones. And they went through this long, complicated process, and they did it. And my impression is that the process to do this, even though technically the additions are somewhat more complicated in the DMARC records, sort of the ICANN process would be pretty much the same. And again, if you're adding new EPP stuff, you need to define it. But I mean, I guess I'm saying that while it makes sense to keep in mind that there are downstream costs, that the difference between making a small change and making a large change in the process is actually not all that much, because as soon as you make any sort of change, the whole process fires off. Does that sound right?
Yeah, all of that's true. I think that fundamentally, don't really want to get into, what has to happen on the ICANN side. There really fundamentally are two choices for what one can do on that side of things. You can either do things on an individual registry side, which is essentially what bank and insurance did. Yeah. So they kind of did their own thing. Or if you're looking for something which is industry-wide, that's a slightly different process. But those of us who do these things, we understand the differences. We'll sort of figure out as we go along here and deal with those processes as we have to.
Okay, so it sounds like we agree there.
Yeah.
Rick Wilhelm, PIR. For those that don't know, PIRruns.org. The +1 to everything Jim said. Agreed with all of his points. The thing I would also say is that, and I think that Jim and I agree on this, All this stuff notwithstanding, one of the reasons that the GTLD registry operators are here and a number of us are supporting this is because it does open up some new and very important options and capabilities for the registrars that do interact with the GTLD registries. Most notably, it provides some folks that are GTLD registrars a better avenue to offer DNSSEC via DELEG, because right now a lot of them don't offer DNSSEC due to the technical complexity that it causes for their front-end portals and things like that. And so a number of us believe that having DELEG in place is going to lower the bar for certain registrars to offer DNSSEC and other kind of capabilities, because they'll be able to engage with DNS service providers who are quite capable of that sort of thing, and then obviously changes in the delegation model will make that more feasible. So, but completely agree with everything Jim said about the complexities that it's going to offer. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And speaking personally, I've always been a strong DNSSEC advocate on the right circumstances. And this is one of those things, getting back to what Jim Reed said in the beginning, one of the potential applications that this is all useful for. So really looking forward to this moving along.
Paul Hoffman, actually wearing my ICANN staff hat for two things. In case anyone missed it, this is only about GTLDs. As someone just slacked to me, CCTLD operators are going to totally lead on this, and the GTLD folks are going to have some good lessons learned while we're still talking about what we want to do. Second point is to disagree with what John Levine just said, because in fact, once somebody does it, everyone can mimeograph and do that. And there are processes within that staff can do to help grease this. So following what we're doing here in the working group, the requirement that we have a protocol first and then we have extensions to the protocol afterwards is really helpful, because that will get us almost all of the way there. And once we have individual ones, making the allowing those in will be potentially much faster. That is, we don't have to wait.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Hi. So, not at the zone cut. Next slide, please. So, what's this about? Well, my slide deck is arguing to take into consideration to not put the new delegation information or the extensible delegation information at the parent side of the zone cut. And well, the reasons for that are in the upcoming slides. But I think it's a fundamental design choice which has consequences for which software is affected and how it is affected, what the ease of deployment will be for the extensible delegation of DELEG. And it may impact requirements, or at least how things are expressed in requirements. And perhaps it should be a consideration which should be taken along in the requirements document. Next slide. So what design choice am I talking about? Well, maybe we think that delegation information, or currently in the DNS, is at the legacy delegation point, which is the parent side of the zone cut. And for the slide deck, or I am arguing that it could also be elsewhere in the zone. And for the sake of example, I reference two protocol proposals which are already there, but it's not really about the protocol proposals. It's only about the general idea of putting it somewhere else. But there's one protocol proposal which puts it at the parent side of the zone cut, and there's one proposal which puts it elsewhere. Both ideas originate from the IETF 118 hackathon. Both are based on extending SVCB, which is completely irrelevant for this presentation. So in the first proposal on the left, you have a DELEG, a new resource record type, which is authoritative at the parent side of the zone code. And in the other protocol proposal, it's a SVCB resource record set, which is elsewhere authoritative, be present in the parent zone. Next slide, please. So a NS resource record set in the parent says that everything at that name and below that name is not authoritative in that parent zone. Right? That's what the delegation says. So even the NS resource record set itself is not authoritative in the parent zone. So if you take this example.com NS resource record set in the .com zone, then everything at or below example.com is not authoritative in the com zone, except for DS and NSEC. But new data will not, or new resource record types will not be signed by unmodified signers, will not be returned by unmodified name servers. Instead, the delegation will be returned, or the referral response will be returned. And if it is signed by .com's DNS key, then unmodified validating resolvers or unmodified validators will not consider it secure because the wrong party is signing for it. Next slide, please. Thus, new authoritative independent resource records require modified DNSSEC signers, modified name servers for returning it in referral responses and for returning it when queried for, and modified DNSSEC validators already apart from a new delegation mechanism implemented in the resolver. Next slide, please. On the other hand, if you put the delegation information elsewhere in the parent zone, then semantics, dangerous word, with respect to what is authoritative, remain as is. So it is authoritative in the com zone, the example that I'm giving there, example._deleg.com. It will be signed by unmodified signers. It will be returned by unmodified name servers. Unmodified DNSSEC validators will validate it. And you can do with a implementation in the resolver only to make this way of delegation work. Next slide. Also, all the features that we currently have in DNS just keep working as they are working now. So the conventional methods to alias remain functional. You can outsource a delegation to a single operator. And now one of the requirements is to have it alias to multiple operators. But if it's a single one, you can just use CNAME, or you could delegate the whole operation of delegations for your zone to a different party with a DNAME, for example. Next slide. So, new authoritative independent resource records will not be returned by unmodified name servers, and they cannot be queried for by resolvers. So a mechanism that uses new authoritative independent resource records will need a signaling mechanism to indicate to the resolver there should have been a new extensible delegation or a new DELEG. And the example protocol proposal uses a flag and DNS key for that, but it signals with a flag that all authoritative servers serving.com in our example, need to support DELEG. So it's mixing zone content with name server operations. There's no separation of concern. Alternatively, if you put it elsewhere authoritatively in parent, then some authoritative servers may support it and return it in referral responses, and some may not. And it doesn't really matter because the resolver, if it doesn't get it, can query for it and check if it's already there or if it's there. Next slide. But every non-extensible delegation zone will get 2 queries? No. So indeed, if you assume a resolver-only implementation, or if you assume that there will be situations where there's not supporting the authoritative service, then each new zone will get an extra query asking for the possible referral in the new subdomain. But the NSEC records that would show for a zone that does not contain that kind of delegations also reveal that closest and closer, the underscore DELEG, does not exist, right? By showing that the closest closer is .com, and we have another NSEC records going over underscore DELEG. So there's one extra query cost for non-DELEG containing zones to discover that it's not there. Or you could also use a DNS key flag in our situation, and then it doesn't cost any extra query, but then the DNS key flag would mean something else. If it would mean there are delegations in this zone. And it would not mean all the authoritative servers serving this zone support DELEG. So unsigned zones need another additional query, I guess, because then you don't have the NSEC records showing that it's there or not. Or we could say for unsigned zones, we only support DELEG if the authoritative also supports it, and do without the extra query. Next slide. So in summary, at the zone kit, name servers, signers, DNSSEC validators, resolvers all need to change. Not at the zone kit, can work with the resolver implementation only already. At the zone kit, you need a new aliasing mechanism. Not at the zone kit, you can reuse CNAME and DNAME. At the zone kit, all name servers serving a zone need to be upgraded at once. Not at the zone kit, you can have incremental deployment of non-mixed or full set of name servers that support it. At the zone kit, 0 extra queries. Not at the zone kit, it can work with 0 extra queries, or we could allow a few more to make it somewhat simpler. Next slide. This is not a new notion. There's a very interesting panel discussion about DELEG in one of the encrypted DNS series from Andrew Kempling, where Paul Vixie says that putting DS on the zone kit has been a mistake, and that deployment of DNSSEC might have been faster or easier if it would have been put somewhere else, authoritatively in the parent zone. And here's the link if you want to review that. Next slide. Yeah, and that's it.
David.
Hello, it's Dale. So first, thank you very much for bringing this discussion. I do think it's a really important discussion. I'm happy to have it. I think it's also very workable, so I'm not going to tear it down as being unreasonable. I do still have a preference for being at the parent side of the zone cut, and some of the reasons for that include that it does increase some complexity in the size of the graph, for example, for the zone. Some extra, depending on how you implement it, like I could see where the resolver signals to a knowledgeable parent that, oh, I also want this information, but whether it does it in 2 packets or in 1, it's still causing extra lookups in the parent as well. Through pretty much any reasonable implementation you do with that, possibly with additional string processing involved in that. And one of the other big things for me is that long term, I want to see a new mechanism be like a first class citizen, and putting it under a separate name and a separate namespace would continue for years to come to make it look like it was just an afterthought. When, while it is an afterthought, that's true, if it hopes to grow up and be the main way that things are being done, I think that a zone cut is better. And the final thought that I have on all that is I would be somewhat more concerned, as you are, about another, authoritative side record for the zone cut, if not for the fact that we do have the experience of DS in that regard. And while that was not, as far as implementations were concerned, I have not really seen that putting DS on authoritative in the parent really caused any measurable problems. And so, all things considered, I don't think an RR that's now authoritative in the parent at the cut would be that disastrous an outcome.
Yeah. So DS in the parent, authoritative in the parent now does not cause problems because it has taken 15 years or longer to make it work in all the software. It had a very long path towards this. We can do without extra queries, or that can be done with this way of having the delegation information as well. But I think it's acceptable to have an extra query. It's comparable to the DNS key query with respect to how much more traffic that will cause. And also, I don't agree that it's not a first-class citizen. Because, so I think if you look at if DNS would be completely redesigned, then I think it would be more logical to put the names of the delegations on the edges and not on the nodes. So to have it at 2 places is, I feel, also a sort of design mistake, so to say. And yeah.
Joe? Hello. I think this idea looks really ugly, but it's also really, really good. And I think we have Stockholm syndrome from zone cuts. I think we've been considering zone cuts for so long that this looks wrong, but I can't think, this actually looks deployable. I mean, this actually seems good to me. If you could imagine a future where the only NS records exist at the apex of the zone and you no longer need them in the parent, that is a glorious future. Yeah. So I think this is really good. This makes me a lot happier than every other DELEG thing. I think you should give it another name because DELEG, I think, is a dirty name now. You should think of a better name for it.
Thanks. So also, I'd like to mention that the protocol proposals that we are not discussing, but the one that doesn't have it authoritatively at the parent side, does already have a proof of concept implementation in unbound only. So it can work with just unbound doing that. Yep.
Ben Schwartz. I do think that our aesthetic taste will adapt. I wanted to ask how you would avoid doubling the query load on unsigned zones.
So you can ask for, or you mean when it does contain DELEG information or when it does not?
I was mostly thinking about when it does not.
When it does not, you You can do an explicit query for _DELEG. If it's an annex domain, then you can cache that information.
Okay.
But we could also say, okay, for unsigned zones, you need to have support in the authoritative name server. That's another option.
Okay. As someone who operates a name server that does not correctly respond with NX domain versus no data, that's a very interesting idea. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Ray Bellis, ISC. Willem, detail I maybe couldn't or missed in the presentation, but are you expecting _DELEG to be an empty non-terminal, or could it actually itself potentially be a delegation? So once a dirty word.
Yes, I think it has potential for having the delegation information for the zone itself, like the NS set, which is authoritative in the child.
Yeah, because it occurred to me that a lot of Jim Galvin's problems are potentially solved by essentially having _DELEG as being a delegation itself, so that none of the DELEG records end up appearing in the zone as leaf nodes, but essentially as entries in another zone, which is not under ICANN's control, or ICANN's contractual limitations.
Yes, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That can be. I myself gave the example of putting a D name on _DELEG to outsource.
Yeah, in fact, yes, a D name would actually work very well for that, and if that's already permitted. I think in ICANN TLD terms, the only thing that would need to be changed would be to permit the TLD registry to put _DELEG as a reserved name within the TLD registry.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I think so too.
And Roy.
Hi, Roy.
Hey, Willem. Hi. So I just want to point out that while DNSSEC did indeed take a while, it wasn't because of DS at parent. I just want to make that very clear. It did, however, show that authoritative info at parent is possible and indeed feasible and desirable, right? At least at that point. No one at the time ever mentioned the idea of putting DS records in a separate zone, and that Paul Vixie has this afterthought that was indeed nice to have as an afterthought, but not mentioned at the time. But the issue to me is the additional queries. If the parent supports _DELEG with DNSSEC or non-DNSSEC, there will be explicit queries for some type, right? For some RR type under that _DELEG zone. And if you now mention, yeah, but we could actually include that in the delegation response anyway as additional data, then you require changes to the authoritative server, which is what you wanted to avoid to begin with. Now, let's say right now we propose DELEG, right? And if this via the zone code method or your method, it doesn't stop us in the future to come up with yet another way, and maybe a third way. Remember, we had NSEC, and then we had NSEC 3, and some people have proposed NSEC 4 and NSEC 5. Every time you add new parent-side authoritative data with the DS-like method, sorry to shortcut this, you get this information almost for free. But with your proposed method, you need an additional query for each proposed type. So that's my stance on it. Thanks, Willem.
Thank you. You don't need an additional query. The authoritative can support delegation information not at the zone code as well. And then you will just get it in the authority section, just like with a normal referral response. And a resolver can then, for example, cache that this authoritative server is DELEG or does support DELEG and does not need to send extra queries, but can, for that time for which it registers that it supports it, just send the normal legacy DNS queries and expect the extensible delegation to be in the authority section. Though, if it then gets a referral where it is not present, it should send the extra query to look it up. And it can do so as well.
right, so if I do a time check, I think we have 20 minutes. So one of the things that the chairs wanted to do was, we just had 5-ish discussions of various requirements for what DELEG is supposed to do. And what I wanted to do is actually have open mic to see if there are issues that people have seen today that they think are important that aren't in the proposed requirements document. If there are topics they think we need to not consider. But this was really, 20 minutes of chance for people to kind of give their perspectives on what we're trying to do and where they think we should be trying to go. So don't everybody run to the mic, but this is your opportunity to kind of let us hear, either what you agree with today that you've heard or things that we're not considering right now.
Paul Hoffman, reflecting some hallway conversations both this week and last week at the KSK ceremony. And this is not my opinion, but I know there are people who are concerned that some of the requirements in the current document sound like NS records are going to be the way to delegate forever, and this is additional. Other people feel like, yes, but then that's going to switch or whatever. So I would like to see the requirements document not talk about future restrictions about where delegation is and how NS records are. I just think that would simplify our lives. And at some point in the future, when we are mature and we have some experience and such like that, we can make different decisions. But to keep that out, to either write in that we're not doing it or explicitly keep it out, just because I've heard disagreements and I've gone like both ways in hearing them. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I vaguely remember seeing a comment from Tim Wasinski that he is putting an issue on the requirements document related to that. So we'll make sure that it kind of captures what you might be trying to cover.
Eric? Hey, Eric Oswald, George Mason University. I looked through the requirements draft and I might have missed this, so apologies if I did, but it seems to me like it might be useful to, if it's not there, put something in about what should or shouldn't happen with regard to consistencies between NS and DELEG. So if I have both like in a transitionary period and they don't agree, whether someone needs to suggest a precedent order or whatever, but I just didn't see any discussion and apologies if I missed it.
Okay.
Yeah, Jim. Yeah, Jim Reid. We haven't discussed earlier on about zone cut semantics, and I think we've wisely decided to change the language in the draft document to reflect that that's maybe the unfortunate use of wording. But I think we might need to replace that with something else, which may suggest, for example, that we're not expecting authoritative servers to do additional work, or at least having some way of refining that. For example, by having the analog of the do bit, which essentially says is if you've got additional delegation metadata, please send it to me. That might be a way to kind of signal that. But I think we have to use some kind of, think about some kind of mechanism like that. Because if we don't do that, we're going to have a weird situation where we don't really know what kind of signaling is going to be needed between the authoritative and recursive servers.
All right, thanks, Jim.
Go ahead, Ben.
Hi. I had, 2 points. I just revived a slightly expired draft, so it's back. It's called Dane with service bindings or something like that, and it's in DNSO. And it basically lays out how the service B and TLSA records are supposed to interact, which has been a little bit underspecified up to this point. So that draft predates the entire DELEG effort and was basically my attempt to try to solve essentially some version of this problem by stitching together making a sort of patchwork solution out of service B and TLSA and NS records. It seems like, that patchwork is not really the direction people want to go. Instead, we have, an attempt here to create a fully fledged solution. And so I think there's a really interesting question about what to do with that draft, which basically otherwise would shortly enter working group last call in DNSO. So I'd appreciate people's thoughts about that, and especially chairs who are thinking about where documents go it would be great to see if we can come up with some smart solution there.
Yeah, so we can definitely chat with the DNS op chairs. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind here is we need to get the requirements document going before we can actually consider solutions.
Yeah, and this solution is several steps ahead. It interacts with DELEG if the DELEG working group settles on a service B derived solution, which is by no means certain. The other thing I wanted to mention, again related to service B, that I think is just interesting for folks to ponder, is that service B and the HTTPS record are designed for a client that's performing a de novo connection every time it uses the record. So a web browser client, in the traditional conception, when at the point that it's doing DNS resolution for a domain, it doesn't really know anything. It doesn't have a lot of history that tells it how to interact with that host. That has changed over time, but that's the traditional view. And so the service B record tries to convey everything you might need to know. DNS resolvers are different. We imagine traditionally that they keep a lot of state about the authoritative name servers they're interacting with. And so an example of where this comes to a head is that service B has a concept of priorities that say this is the most preferred server, this is the second most preferred, et cetera. But if you're a very smart resolver who actually knows which of those servers is closer or more reliable, then that conflicts with those priorities. So I think there's some interesting tension there that we are going to have to resolve somehow.
Thanks, Ben.
Mark?
Mark Andrews, ISC. Let me get my notes up. I heard about dealing with unsigned zones. I don't see DELEG records delegation information like this being in an unsigned zone, because there's no real way to validate the information. We're trying to do a secure trust, so we need to say this must be inside a assigned zone. That's one thing. And the other thing is, we introduced NSEC 3. We had to change things to signal that to the rest of the world a zone was structured with NSEC 3 records. We need the same sort of signaling for DELEG if we're doing it. So you go into a zone, if it's going to have DELEG in it, it's signaled that when you enter that zone, you are going to get back delegation information beyond NS records. And if you don't get either a proof that it exists or a proof that it doesn't exist in your referral, there is something wrong. I know this means doing more work and slows things down a little bit as validators and recursive servers come up to stream, come up online. But historically, getting new support for this stuff has taken a minuscule amount of time to everything else. I'm not worried about getting recursive servers that understand delegation up and deployed fast, or about getting them servers which return that being deployed fast. We don't need to, I think it's a non-issue. And in terms of deploying, having DELEG or whatever the name of the record end up being at the delegation point versus the other, I've heard at the delegation point, it's clearer. And you can return an NSEC or an NSEC 3 record saying there is no delegation information as part of the referral. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Mark.
Yep, thanks, Mark. Andrew.
Hi, my name's Andrew Sullivan. I work for the Internet Society for another, I don't know, 6 weeks, but I'm not speaking for them. I heard Joe Abley get up at the microphone. This is actually a comment on some comments, not on any particular draft. But I heard Joe Abley get up and say, "Oh, he's looking forward to the glorious future in which there's no more NS record delegation." And I heard Paul get up and say, "We need to not talk about that." And I think that's a bad idea to like both look forward to it and not talk about it, because I'm having hives thinking about the IPv4, IPv6 transition, you know, as a sort of historical analogy. So I don't know that it needs to be in the requirements draft, but I think like somewhere we need to be serious about like if that's the plan, or if this is supposed to be some path towards you know, some kind of future adaptation of the way the DNS is going to evolve. We better have a story about it, because you know, unplanned stories turn out not so well. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Florian Opser, speaking as a DNS Directorate reviewer. So I just tried to review the incremental DELEG draft to just see how would that work. And 3 things came to mind. One is, this is kind of obvious, but it would be nice if the requirements document would say an implementation, well, must conform to the requirements. We're not saying that. It's kind of obvious, but you know. And then, like the draft that tries to implement the requirements should spell out how the authors think that they're conforming to this. As a reviewer, I don't want to guess at this. So this would probably be discussed somewhere in the mailing list and all this, but I just get the draft here, review this thing, and there's no information for that. On a practical note, the requirements are just bullet points, which makes it difficult to refer to them. So maybe they should just be numbered or something like that. And a third thing, the requirements need to be written in a way that you can actually state that you conform to them. I think that's currently the case for all of them that we list, but if they're incredibly vague, then you will never be able to say, oh, I conform to them. Thanks.
Thanks, Florian. Joe.
I think there might be a way to look forward to a world where only the new thing happens, but also tolerate the old thing happening. And I think this mixes in with some of the comments about extra queries and extra work being done and things like that. I think maybe something could, it feels like there could be a requirement that says it's okay to require new work, or more queries or something for the legacy mechanism, if the new mechanism doesn't suffer from those things, which might provide an incentive to move beyond the actual functionality, and it allows the long tail to survive, just not very well. I think that might be okay. So, you know, I think it's possible to do both, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other comment before we move on? All right, so the last presentation is actually by Roy. It's really just kind of a 5-minute overview of one possible way of doing this. It's really just more informational than anything else, since we are going to be focused more on the requirements side of things, but we wanted to give him an opportunity to talk about it a little bit. So Roy, over to you.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So what is this about? This is about documenting DNSSEC protocol changes if we're going to do this the zone cut way. The idea is basically to separate the method to present these records to the end client from the actual DELEG record itself. And in this case, I'm going to use the word parent-only records. So a parent-only means parent-side delegation point records that are signed similarly to DS records, and similar changes that needed to happen for the DS records we need to make for these kind of records. And I think these changes to the protocol are substantial enough to justify a separate document. So away from what DELEG is, basically a document that shows how to do this, how to present this information to the client. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right. So why do we separate? Why do I want to separate this from the DELEG draft? I want to ensure that it's future-proof. So I hope you all remember. I feel sorry for you if you do. The NSEC3 signal that we needed to have to support NSEC3 records. It was the I think it was the signature algorithm. RSA shout something dash NSEC3. To me, that was a clutch, but it was a necessary clutch. Now, I can imagine if we deploy DELEG now, or in the near future, that right after that, someone has a new idea that doesn't really fit with the new DELEG, and we will have DELEG 2, DELEG 3, or something else that needs to be on the parent side, etc., etc. And I don't want to invent new signals to support all these newer features in the future. Next slide, please. So what needs to happen? Well, we need to document these DNSSEC protocol changes. So create a standalone document detailing the changes needed to support these future parent-only records. We will designate parent-only types. I'm saying here in this slide, assign a range of parent-only types. What I do mean is reserve a range of parent-only RR types for future use. Basically, they would behave the same way as DS records behave now. And this ensures that authoritative servers include these records when they are present in a zone, in a delegation, right, without the need to understand them. I hope that makes sense. We also need to, for every delegation, we need to require authenticated denial records, like NSEC or NSEC3. And this is to prove that there are or there are not these records present. And the reason I'm saying this is because if you look at current secure delegation, there are DS records. And when there are DS records, there are no NSEC records present in a delegation response. So we will always need these NSEC records to prove, or NSEC3 records, to prove that there are no additional parent-side only records. We also need to have a secure signal because there are we need a signal to validators that they should expect an NSEC or NSEC3 record in this. Next slide, please. Now, this is not a new idea. This is also not my idea. I happen to write, to help write, or to propose text to the DELEG draft that does this. But Peter van Dijk and Peter Spacek wrote a very similar, if not the same, document in 2020, draft Peter DNS parent side auth types. And Paul Wouters, who I can see sitting in the room, hi Paul. Paul Wouters had the exact same idea. I don't know if it's independent of him, but he was the one who right before this presentation told me the existence of this document, and it's exactly the same thing I'm proposing here. Now, either 3 people or 4 people are completely wrong, or we're onto something. I don't know. I don't have to have this document to be adopted. What I want is a separation of DELEG, the record, right, and the way it's presented to the client and the changes that needs to be done in DNSSEC. So I don't need any questions. If you have them, feel free to ask them privately. This was just an informational. I would be happy to have this conversation on the DELEG mailing list. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and I just want to say I miss you all. I wish I was there. Cheers, guys.
Go ahead, Paul.
Paul Wouters, not speaking as an AD. So the reason I didn't really push that draft much other than sort of give it as a proof of concept idea and send it to I think the then DNS Ops mailing list is that I'm still on the fence on whether we need to separate a selection of parental class RR types like that draft suggests, or whether we should just bite the bullet and say, let's just stuff it into the DS record, because then we're avoiding all these, like, we have to wait 4 years to deploy before this all kind of works. So like, if we're doing this once, maybe use a subsection of the DNS algorithm field and make that basically mean, oh, this is really a parental RR type. And that's another document I wrote up as a proof of concept that's there to see. So since I wasn't really sure what approach was better, I wrote kind of both drafts and sort of hoped for discussion.
Can I add to that? From 50 miles high, there are basically now 3 proposals, right, to present DELEG to a resolver. One is Willem Torup's _ DELEG zone. Number 2 is Paul Wouters' message to put it in a DS record, and number 3 is to have additional set of records to basically what DELEG proposes. I just want to point it out. There are three different methods now, and I'm not here to support any of the 3. I just want to make sure that it's separated from the DELEG draft.
Jim Reid. Hey, Roy. Thanks for that presentation. You started to make my head hot. There's so many things that you put forward there that need a lot of careful consideration. But I think the important point that you really made there, and I think it's something we need to underline at this stage, is we shouldn't be thinking about this in terms of either resource record types or particular techniques. And so we're using the term DELEG. I think we're talking about is some new meta way of expressing delegation information rather than how we actually express that in the DNS with resource records or naming conventions or whatever else it is. And certainly at the moment, I think we're at the stage where we have to be neutral about this because we don't have any clear idea yet about what's going to be the best way forward.
I completely agree. I think the content of a DELEG record could be discussed here, but I think changes to the actual DNS protocol that 2 of the 3 proposals have or do this via an _ DELEG zone could be held in, for instance, DNS op. But I'm not preaching to the choir here, I think.
All right. Last call for any discussion on Roy's presentation. If not, we allocated the last few minutes to wrapping up here at next steps.
So I heard a couple of things today that I wanted to see, what the working group was thinking here. The first one is the proposed DELEG requirements document. It's currently an individual submission. So I'm going to do a quick, show of hands poll in MeetEcho just to see if people feel like that is a good basis for a working group document. We'll have to follow up with a call on the mailing list, but tends to help to kind of give everybody a chance to voice that here. And if there are things we want to discuss, bring them up. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer the poll. Well, I would venture to guess that is a pretty strong statement that people think this is a good document to adopt. So we'll follow this up on the mailing list just to confirm the consensus. The other thing that I wanted to ask everybody to think about, some of the comments we had on the earlier discussion session, there were some good ideas in there. I want to make sure that we follow up on those on the mailing list, especially as they relate to the requirements, making sure we capture the things that people think are important So with that, any last thoughts or comments people have on this effort? Paul.
Did not have my laptop crash on the ground. IETF working groups tend to schedule their time around IETF meetings. We're 4 months away almost from another IETF meeting. One way to look at this is we've got plenty of time to work on requirements, get them right. The other is we're completely blocked on the stuff we want to work on and such like that. I would love to see us finish requirements before the next IETF meeting. So the next IETF meeting could be on protocol discussion. I'm not saying we have to, but I think the default would be, oh, we're having a lot of discussion. Look, oh, we're having more discussion. Therefore, we're not going to finish before the next IETF meeting. We'll finish there. I would like to see that not be the default.
So before you walk away, Paul, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you asking the working group to make sure that we're doing,
that we're aiming at finishing, not just discussing?
Sure. Yeah. But are you proposing anything beyond doing that work on the mailing list?
No, not at all. I mean, if an interim would help, sure, whatever. All I'm saying is we fall into a time default, and I don't think we need to on this one. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but if we aim to finish well before, that gives us the next one to start talking actually about the protocols, which, let's face it, we're all itching to do.
Okay. Paul, what does finish mean? Like
that the
IETF
requirements document has been sent to IETF last call, not that it's been published. That is enough, even if there are some changes from IETF last call. In my mind, that's enough for us to then begin working on protocols. Area directors might disagree, but I think that would be a very good indicator, even if we have to change some things based on IETF last call or ISG review.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Warren.
I mean, I'd love to see that too, but I'm entertained by Paul's optimism that we might actually accomplish it.
Tail.
Hi, it's Tail. I think actually Paul is pretty practical. I don't think it's undue optimism. I have captured, I believe, most of the issues that were brought up as suggestions as far as requirements are concerned. We, the authors, should be able to turn that around pretty quickly again, and once it's adopted into the group. What I'm hearing from the sense of the room, and maybe this is my undue optimism, is there's not a tremendous amount of controversy actually of what we'll be able to lay down as this initial document for getting us started on protocol work. So the authors of the requirements draft will be working to make that happen, and I also support Paul's idea that maybe next time we can be working on protocol.
Okay. One thing I would add to what Tail just said, in order for them to get that document in good shape, that also means that everybody in the working group has to be providing comments and feedback so that we as chairs understand the consensus of the working group.
Yeah, that's the last thing I meant to mention was that, so the issues I opened were in Tim's Git repository. Anything that's still not covered will be moved to issues in the DELEG group repository. But if you want to submit something now, head over to Moonshiner and do it there. Okay.
And then the last action item that I recall, Paul's going to send the text from his discussions, and Dwayne and I will post that in the working group GitHub so that we have a record of it and people can review it and provide any feedback they might have on it. All right. Last chance. Hit your button, Warren. Warren, hit your button.
Just a note in the chat, Andrew Camplin suggested maybe an interim to work on getting requirements. That's not a bad idea.
Yeah, that's part of what I was asking, Paul. If people are interested in the interim, let the chairs know. Those are relatively easy to schedule, right, Warren? And we can try and pull that off. All right. Thank you, everybody. We are giving you 12 minutes back in your day. Oh, sorry, Wes says we have to stay. All right, thanks everybody. See you in Dublin.
Not which I think